Hello and welcome to Actually, a new podcast that is dedicated to providing in-depth analysis of key issues shaping the Nigerian economy. This podcast is hosted by Vestance, a business consulting outfit that offers quality advisory services to help small and medium enterprises grow their business. You can learn more about Vestance at www.vestanceng.com. Again, that is www.vestanceng.com. This is the second episode in this podcast series. You can check out the first and future episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and YouTube. In 2007, two Nigerian musicians, Too Short and Nice, released a song which they titled Make Them Talk. For non-Yoruba speakers, these lyrics basically ask the question, why has food become so expensive in Nigeria? That was 16 years ago. Fast forward to today and not much has changed. Garri remains expensive and kuli is not cheaper either. So on today's episode of the podcast, we shall be discussing food inflation in Nigeria. You might have guessed that. Over the next half hour, we will analyze the causes, the effects, and possible solutions to rising food prices in Nigeria. My name is Ridwan Bello, and with me on the show today are two important guests. My first guest is Yusuf Ogunbiyi, an executive leading operations at Afex, a private commodities trading house operating in Nigeria and other African countries. Welcome to the show, Yusuf.
Yeah, nice to be here. Good evening, Ridwan.
My second guest is Akiwale Alabi, who is an experienced farm management executive and co-founder of Corporate Farmers International Limited, an agricultural consulting and farm management company. He is also popular on Twitter, and Twitter users may know him as Farmer Akin Alabi. Welcome to the show, Akin.
All right, thanks very much. It's also great to be here with you.
So let's begin with a bit of background here. And I'm going to start with you, Yusuf. Tell us, how high really have food prices become in Nigeria? Paint us a picture.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. A number of us must have experienced, or if not all of us, must have experienced the high prices of food in the country, whether you're talking about raw food, processed, or fully processed food, as the case may be. For instance, if you had gone to the market around, say, November, December last year to buy a bag of maize, white maize or yellow maize, you will probably have bought it at around 19,500, 20,000 naira per bag. If you go to that same market to buy maize today, you would probably be buying it somewhere around 54, 55,000 naira, depending on the market you go to eventually. And I'm picking maize here because it's a very critical element of the diet of Nigerians across board, and it translates across board as well, whether you're thinking of food consumed by humans or feed consumed by animals, which are then consumed by humans at the end of the day. This has led to a lot of impacts, huge impact on household expenses. Households have now had to cut back on consumption. Depending on where you visit, if you go to the urban centers, you see people substituting for cheaper food items, or if you go to other rural areas where people don't even have so many options to substitute with, they have to cut back heavily on what they consume and reduce the protein content, which is the first thing that gets thrown off the plate, right? When you have, say for instance, you have your tuwo masara and then you are eating it with some soup, the first thing that goes off the plate is the meat or the fish that is taken to complement that. So if you also think of it from an industrial standpoint, you also look at the poultry industry, which is a heavy consumer of maize in the country. A lot of poultry farms have had to cut back heavily on the layers, broilers that they keep, and a lot of them have also had to shut down temporarily. And that's where we are now. Literally, the MBS numbers also reflect this. Food inflation has gone up tangibly, significantly over the course of the year, and it has affected all and sundry.
Thank you very much. I want to stick with you here, Yusuf. So let's talk about the causes of food inflation in Nigeria. Why exactly have prices been going up? When you think about this, through the lens of basic economics, right? Economic theory would suggest that when the price of a commodity is going up, it's usually because the demand is too much or the supply is too little. Let's unpack these two factors, starting with demand. Yusuf, explain to us what has been the trend in food demand over the past few years. Tell us.
So Nigeria has an average growth rate of, I think, 2.6% per annum in terms of population, right? And that means that you constantly have a stream of people um joining the population, increasing the consumption of food items in the country. You also have a country that has a median age of 19 to 21 years, if I'm not mistaken. That means that you have a lot of young people in this country. And when you have a lot of young people, you have people consuming more and more variety of items across board. So demand has continued to increase over the past few years. Demand has increased. However, supply has not kept up. Supply has been quite abysmal, to say the least, and there's been a lot of factors stemming from trade policy for the country, stemming from weather, stemming from the decision to increase or decrease certain types of consumption of certain items. So if you look at the poultry industry has expanded a lot in response to the demand of the population, actually. And that means that you now have more demand for maize, more demand for soya beans, and a number of other commodities in the country. If you look at the trade policy has been quite internal, if you look at it from that angle, to say the least. So that means that there's been a lot of focus on internal production, encouraging local production of the food we consume. However, productivity levels have not increased as much as you would want them. So you are looking at productivity gains of probably 50 to 70% to, if not 100% in some instances, to cover for some of the gains that you've seen in demand. And if you want to drive local production, those productivity gains are super critical to ensure that prices don't go out of spiral. So I would say, to sum it up, demand has been increasing, albeit gradually, but over the years it's been tangible. However, supply has not actually been able to keep up with that demand. And like I said, it's an element of whether the rains are enough to produce what you need to produce, or the rains are excessive and then you lose some of the products that has been produced, or it's an element of trade policy, closing borders, opening borders, lack of direction in some instances, and then you would have you not get the typical response you want from the supply side as well to meet up with the demand. So at this point, we are in a net deficit for most products, if not all products that we consume in the country, and that means that you would also have to produce locally a lot more. One last thing that is not mentioned quite commonly is the foreign exchange, right? We had the naira at 360, it went to 600, 650, it went to 750. Now it's settling at around 910 thereabouts. That means that it becomes increasingly more expensive to import any item into the country. So if your local production and productivity levels are not catching up, and bringing the food into the country will even be way more expensive, and access to the being able to bring that food into the country becomes a huge challenge for anybody. So that those are the factors that, for me, it's demand increasing gradually, but then over the course of the years, it's been tangible. Those increments have been tangible, but then supply has not been able to keep up at all.
Thank you, Yusuf. So I want to piggyback on the points that you've raised. So demand has increased, albeit gradually, due to a young population that is also growing, while supply has not been able to keep up due to a number of factors that you mentioned. So trade policies, weather, low agricultural productivity, and you also mentioned foreign exchange going up, which makes food importation more expensive. Now, Akin, I would like to come to you here. Beside these factors that Yusuf already mentioned. Are there other factors at play that Yusuf has not mentioned?
All right,
Tell us.
thanks so much. So one major factor that I have actually experienced within a couple of months over the time is the aspect of logistics and distribution. This alone has affected farmers from moving commodity easily from point A to point Z. And we know today that food production is majorly within the northern part of the country. So, what it takes to move a commodity from a particular state, i.e., let's say Jigawa State, down to Lagos. So, if we compare the cost of logistics or transportation to the cost of production and purchasing power of every individual, you can't wait because of the fact that definitely you buy at a very high cost. Now, we need to also begin to solve that problem of food distribution easily. And over the years, we've only been moving our food majorly through road, and this has caused a whole lot of, can I call it loss? A whole lot of breakage in the ecosystem or in the food chain system, majorly for smallholder farmers or for producers. A typical example is, let's say I'm planting tomatoes in somewhere in, let me use Nasarawa, and I need to move my tomatoes from Nasarawa down to Mount 12. And unfortunately, when my trailer gets to Jeba, the truck develops issue. Probably the tire burst, or it fell, or not even fell, tire burst, and probably the vehicle doesn't have GIT insurance, and the driver has to spend another night in Jeba. Now, don't forget that I have a perishable good that is being moved, which, if it's not properly well stocked or properly well packed, it gets spoils easily. Now, these are gaps that again we need to begin to look at and begin to close for food security. Logistics, a major critical issue, and food distribution. If we don't begin to close that gaps, we'll still begin to repeat the same thing over and over and over again. And I do pray. One of the things that I'm clamoring for is that this new administration will see the effect or the value of rail system, okay, in moving or transporting majorly consumables, perishable consumables from a destination to another destination within a short period of time, to avoid unnecessary delay in food distribution process. That is one. Then two, one of the things that I'm always clamoring for is the angle of processing. Okay, most of our farmers today are majorly producers within the ecosystem. The mentality of only producing and selling to smallholder farmers, or no, selling to middlemen, is always there. Okay, we need to move from that cycle of producing alone to the cycle of processing. When we have processing zones around production centers, it makes it easy for farmers to create wealth. And also it makes it also easier for an investor, okay, to see a channel of investment, to say, okay, if I'm setting up a production of, let's say, rice farm on probably 1,000 hectares of farmland, then beside my 1,000 farm, I have a processing rice mill that once I'm harvesting, immediately I'm processing and bagging, and I'm selling to Lagos. So these are two major areas that I feel that we need to look at for proper and adequate food security.
Excellent. Thank you, Akin. So you raise two critical issues, right, that undermine food security in Nigeria. The first is gaps in agricultural logistics, and you suggested that there should be greater focus in promoting, the distribution of agricultural goods by rail rather than road. And then you also mentioned that there is insufficient value creation because producers are focusing only on production when they should be focusing on processing as well. So we've discussed extensively about the causes and the implications of food inflation in Nigeria. Let's talk about solutions. Yusuf, I want to come back to you for a second here. What can the government do to make food more affordable for Nigerians? In the short term, immediate solutions that the government can put in place to slow down the rising food prices in Nigeria? Explain to us, Yusuf.
So here's the gist, right? Nigeria has two major production cycles. We have the wet season and the dry season production cycle. So the wet season is the major one, which is where a lot of the goods, a lot of the produce we consume are produced, right? So that's gone more or less because all the planting has been done. We are only waiting for harvest. The second one is the dry season, which is when there's wheat, I think there's tomatoes in some places, there's paddy rice and a number of other commodities, right? So the long and short is, if we want very quick solution, quick fixes here and there, it goes back to the question on subsidy. What do you subsidize? Do you quickly subsidize fertilizers so that farmers get fertilizers at 10,000 naira? Do you want to subsidize seeds so that they get them at maybe a third of the original price? Um, so that's like the quickest solution you can provide. Or in alternatively, the government can decide to say, okay, we impose a ban on importation of certain food items. We are lifting those bans for this time period so that more food can come into the country. So these are solutions that are quite they may change the trajectory of where the government intended to go to, but then they may provide those quick fixes that everybody is looking out for. So subsidy, policy changes, basically. That's where some of these things can be done.
Excellent. So you touched upon, increasing agricultural subsidies, input subsidies to, help grow food supply in Nigeria. And then you also mentioned relaxing trade barriers that currently prohibit food importation. Now, I want to come back to you, Akin. So Yusuf has mentioned short-term solutions. Let's look at the longer term as well. What are certain policy options that are available for the government to improve and enhance food security in the longer term?
Let me use a break gap of span of, let's say, 2-3 years. Yeah. What are the things that government needs to do? Number one, it's more embedded on policy. And when I mean policy, I mean working policy. Then two, state government. Now, I always use this as an example for me anytime I'm having this conversation. For any nation to achieve full sustainability, there is need to work deeply with the state government. And I'll use my example of when I was serving about 20 years back in Kebbi State. I served in a community called Zuru. Zuru is in Kebbi. Now, because I was close to the local farmers in that particular community, I understood that the power of agriculture was deeply rooted in the local government. Because in every local government, there are specific clusters of farmers that are producing before it's being taken down to their state governments for counting and whatever, for input distribution or whatever, but is rooted within the local government. The local government knows the number of farmers that are planting rice, that are planting millet, that are planting soya, that are planting maize, and every other commodities. The local government have that record. So we need to take agriculture back to the local government and say, look, give us farm registers of farmers in this particular LGA that is producing specific produce. Now, with this, it is easier for government, which now takes me back to what Yusuf said. It is easier for government, state government particularly, to know how well they can begin to empower, enrich, and also directly affect the smallholder farmers within those states. So state government has a huge responsibility to play in the future, or let's say in the long-term policy of food productivity in Nigeria. If you don't work on that, it will be difficult because dependency is still going to be on federal government. And I always use Lagos State as my own case study, really because I've worked with the government of Lagos State government on projects around agriculture during the past administration. And regardless of the small size Lagos has, it's been able to create policies that directly affect smallholder farmers around communities like Agege, Epe, Badagry, Ikorodu, Lagos Island. And when I say directly affect farmers, I'm not talking crops alone. I'm looking at other value chain which Lagos has the enterprise. For example, poultry production, fish production, and also those who are into horticulture. Yeah. So they've been able to understand what each community or LGA is producing, and thereby being able to provide some level of could be funding, it could be some level of input to these smaller farmers. Then the most importantly, basically because we have an age gap, okay, of a farming of and an age gap in the farming world today. Let's say Nigeria, for example. A typical farmer you see in the north today is averagely 50, 40, 50, 60. Yeah. And how best do we need begin to transcend our younger agripreneurs to find a career in agribusiness? Now, that is another challenge that could lead to food security for a long term. We need to begin to build. Who I call the future farmers, those that will help transform the agricultural revolution for the next couple of years. And I always use the music industry as my case study. I said, if you look at 5, 6 years ago, we have the likes of, let's say, Two Face, the major artists over then, legends that were, everywhere, the rave of the movement. But as time goes on, we are now in the era of the new genre of music. We have the Rema, we have the Ruga, we have Fireboy, and the likes. That is the dynamism with agriculture. It will get to a point whereby the 50, 60 aged farmers won't be able to farm anymore. Then what do we have in place to ensure we begin to bring our new generation of farmers to create a career in agriculture? Today, averagely, we graduate across the entire institution, we graduate over and above 100,000 youth, graduate every 5 years from our campuses, over 100 and above, across the country. The question is, what is next for them? How do we begin to create these young minds in clusters and get them set in a value chain? These are the gaps that actually are existing today. And these are where the problems are. We need to begin to create solutions. And again, I always use the fintech industry as my case study again. Fintech has been able to grow because we have young minds that came together in clusters, that comes together in hubs, and find, to find solutions to problems around the financial sector industry. The same thing applies for the agricultural sector. We have lots of problems facing our farmers today. We need to bring young minds together, bring them in hubs, like what you guys are doing at the AFEX, amazing work you did at your hackathon, bring them together and let them find solutions that would solve specific problems around the entire value chain. And that is the future for me. That is the future of Nigeria agricultural sector. These are long-term programs that we need to begin to put in place for us to achieve food sustainability in the next couple of years.
Excellent. So you mentioned two crucial points there, Akin. So you mentioned, first of all, there needs to be more proactive agricultural policies by subnational government, particularly government at the state level. And you also mentioned that there need to be efforts to encourage agricultural entrepreneurship, especially among young Nigerians. I want to ask you a follow-up question on that second point, right? A former president of Nigeria once opined that Nigerian youths need to return to the farm, presumably to help boost agricultural productivity. Is it fair to say that you agree with this argument? Do you think that getting more Nigerians back to the farm is part of the possible solutions to reduce food shortages in Nigeria?
Farming is not it's not an easy win. It's not a venture. It's not a career you venture into and you make your money the next day. We must first of all solve the problem of perception. And the perception we have today about agriculture is still farming. So we must begin to think agriculture beyond farming. When we leave that era, it's now possible for us to look at demystify the entire value chain and begin to create jobs around the value chain. And this takes me back to Dr. Akim Adesina. He was part of those that actually actually got me into the sector because he brought a new wave into the sector. He brought a new aura into the sector, which when you look at him, the question is, I want to be like him. So we need to first of all change that perception angle. It can be done, but it's going to take a lot of work in terms of, first of all, perception change. Most of our graduates today, when they leave um, after 5 years, they end up in Lagos selling perfumes, clothes, doing, and the passion for agribusiness is not there anymore. So we need to begin to create simple agricultural, I could call it startups, agricultural hubs, agricultural communities, whereby you bring them together, like what Samson Ogbole is doing in Abeokuta. Yeah, let them see the prosperity around the sector. Give them what they need. If those who are interested in extension services, provide them what in extension services. If those who are interested in building financial models that will help farmers calculate my profit, my loss, give it to them. If those that are actually interested in technology part of it, mechanized farming, give them the availability tools. Let them build something that would help or aid the work of local farmers. So it's very possible, but it takes, number one, you must demystify the perception angle around it. Create rooms for for our youth to see agriculture as a career. The federal government needs to do a lot of work in perception building, bring in young folks who have interest in the sector, and create value addition projects. Let them see problems and see how they could solve it by injecting funding into what they want to do. With this, we'll have more prosperity around the sector. I believe so.
Excellent. The soundbite that I picked from your response is that we must think about agriculture beyond farms, right? So basically, you're suggesting that there is much more to the agricultural sector than just the people that produce the goods on the farm. So we need to think about the entire value chain rather than just the primary production process, and that for me is a critical point. Now I want to come back to you, Yusuf. So some of our listeners are young people, some of whom Akin is indirectly inviting into agriculture, right? So when they listen to this podcast, assume some of them would like to, venture into the agricultural value chain. I presume that one of the critical challenges that they will face is availability of capital. In your work, in your experience, what are the realistic options that are available for newcomers into Nigerian agribusiness and agriculture to raise capital for their business? Tell us.
So I won't mince words and tell you that, oh, the moment you come in you get capital, you get the money you want and the likes, right? But I think it's gotten a little bit better now. We now have institutions, entities that are designing different programs to capture some of these young people. Let me look at it from a holistic standpoint. So, as a 9 to 5er, right? So, you are a 9 to 5 person, you want to get into the industry one way or the other for whatever function you want to carry out, whether it's tech, whether it's finance, whether it's operations, from whatever angle. I think it's a little bit better now. There are now a few firms that you can boldly say you want to work with, and you'll be able to join. 5 years ago, it was not as easy as what we have now. But as an entrepreneur, right, you want to go into production of a particular commodity, for instance, you would still likely face a challenge there, because if you don't have history, no financial institution will engage you. The moment you have history, then financial institutions will typically engage you and want to deal with you. So I think that's first of all critical to note. You need to build history, and your activity history, basically you need to build it so people recognize you, and that will come from either your own capital from family and friends, capital from close people. With a I think with a million naira, some people can try to farm in up north. Actually, you can try to farm on a 5 hectare farm. Yeah, with a million naira you may be able to do that, and that helps you at the very least try to build that history. Secondly, you also need to build presence, right? People need to know you, not just you doing your stuff in the backyard. People also need to know you. I think that's where groups, forums, fora are quite critical. You join all those clusters that Akim mentioned. That's where they become interesting. So now I'm talking about someone that has maybe $1 million for capital. But when you talk about people that entities, companies that have significant capital that want to come into this space, I think it becomes a little less challenging. What you then need to solve for is the problem of maybe offtake, the problem of technical expertise, and then building gradually rather than building. I don't think anybody can go all out and build 1,000 hectares, for instance, in 1 year and assume that you would have. It's usually kind of like a uphill task in that sense. So it takes some time, like Aki mentioned earlier. Even when you have all the capital, you still need to do it in a very measured, strategic manner. You need the technical expertise, you need the know-how, you need to have the connections, know the right people in the industry to work with. Um, I think that's something. So when you're looking at it from an angle where you don't have the capital, you would need a lot of family support, friend support, just like any other business, to be honest. The tech guys as well, whenever they are starting out, they get capital from friends, and then when they have something tangible, they meet the angel investors, they build it up from there and the likes. That's similar to what you would have to do in the ag space, only that it may be a little bit more challenging, to be very honest. um so number one, you have to be willing to do the hard work. You have to be patient, to be honest, and then you have to be willing to put yourself out there more and more for people to recognize you.
Excellent. So you heard it, listeners. If you're looking to venture into the Nigerian agribusiness sector, those are some useful advice from Yusuf Ogunbiyi. You should build some credit or financial history so that agribusiness firms and also venture capitalists will feel comfortable to extend credit to you. You should also build some presence in the industry. You should know the right people in the industry to work with because you need technical expertise. And above all, be patient. Those are words of wisdom from Yusuf Ogunbiyi. That wraps up the second episode of Actually. On this episode, we discussed food inflation in Nigeria, the causes, the effects, and some possible solutions. Many special thanks to our guests for today, Akinwale Alabi and Yusuf Ogunbiyi, and many special thanks as well to you, our listeners. See you next time. Thank you very much and take care.